Welcome to Season 4 of In the Lead with UCEA. I'm your host, Mónica Byrne-Jiménez, Executive Director of the University Council for Educational Administration. In this podcast, UCEA presents pivotal conversations with people making an impact on educational leadership preparation, practice, and policy. Learn about the latest happenings and cutting-edge research from UCEA's community of scholars. This season, we dive into how education-focused organizations can learn from each other and work to advocate for educational leadership and preparation at the state level. We talk with experts in research, policy, and practice to learn more about the opportunities for state-level advocacy and imagine how we can collaborate to support the success of each and every child. Zeke Perez is Assistant Policy Director at the Education Commission of the States. Zeke tracks legislation related to statewide longitudinal data systems, school safety, and post-secondary campus safety. He has also done recent comparisons of state strategies to support the preparation and development of high-quality school leaders. Zeke has a passion for local politics and enjoys following the varied policy approaches of city and state leaders. His work is a great example of the research and analysis that ECS produces for the field. What does it take to support state-level education policymakers, and what are some effective strategies? Listen here to find out. Welcome to UCEA, Zeke. It's so great to have you on our podcast today.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
I know. I'm so excited about this conversation because I think the work that ECS does is so important and what edifying, particularly for those of us in leadership preparation. But before we sort of dig into that, can you maybe tell our listeners just a little bit about the work that ECS does?
Absolutely, yeah. So we are a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization. We work with all 50 states, the District of Columbia, and the other territories. And we believe in the power of learning from experience. So we try to provide policymakers with resources and information to help them make the best policy decisions that they can. And I can dig a little bit more into our history, how we were created, and some things that kind of shed light on the work that we do, if that would be helpful.
Oh, yeah, no, that would be great. I want to make sure everyone knows the amazing organization that you work with.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I think one thing that sets us apart from other organizations is that we work across the education spectrum. We work from early learning through K-12 through post-secondary education in the workforce. And we also work with a wide mix of policymakers. So whereas some organizations might work with just governors or just legislators, we work across the board. We work with those groups. We also work with state higher ed executives, school board executives, really anyone who's working on state education policy we're working with and connecting them together, providing them with resources. So a little bit about our history. Shameless plug, we're celebrating our 60th anniversary this year at our national forum in Salt Lake City. So we hope to see some of you there.
Excellent.
But yeah, so back in the 60s, ECS was formed as an interstate compact. It was adopted by all states in Washington, D.C. in the 60s and 70s.
Hmm.
And it was created then as a way to help. It was created then to meet the needs of governors and legislators and ultimately all state education leaders to provide them with a way to come together to address challenges and solutions that they shared across states. Especially at that time, things were shifting a little bit more towards the federal government through various acts and various federal funding. So states were looking for a way to counterbalance their say in the education conversation. And so they signed it on to the compact. Now we're in statute across all 50 states and DC. And so states pay dues to ECS. We provide supports. And yeah, we connect with states in that way.
That's fascinating. I never knew that, Zeke. So thanks for thanks
Yeah,
for
of
teaching
course.
us a history lesson. It's always important not to forget where we came from. And so happy birthday, ECS. Um,
Should be a good party. Yeah.
I didn't realize actually, I don't think I appreciated fully this idea of working at different levels within state education policy. Um, so how often do you convene state commissioners or different policymakers during the year, or is it as sort of as an as needed basis?
Yeah, a little bit of both. And that's a great question. The way we support states is through research, reports, convening, and
Mhm.
counsel. And so for research, we're tracking bills. We look at every bill in education policy from introduction. Our great policy team staff and our state relations staff splits those up so that we're, again, tracking any introduced bill and then we're summarizing those enacted bills. So we're really keeping an eye on what is moving across states from that ideation phase all the way to enactment. Uh, so that's one way we're gathering research. We're also sometimes doing qualitative information interviews with states and learning from states directly. We also do 50 state comparisons and other reports that gets into our report section of how we help states. But to your question, yeah, convening and counseling states, we really do a mix. So we have two annual events: our National Forum on Education Policy, which takes place in July, and then our Winter Commissioners meeting, which is purely for the commissioners in our states. Each state has 7 commissioners that they can appoint. Some of those are governor appointees, some are specific education positions within a state that are kind of automatically filled. So those are the core constituents we work with. We bring them together at Winter Commissioners meeting. But then beyond that, we do a lot of other beyond that, we convene state leaders in a lot of other ways, from thinkers meetings where we might have a handful of states in a room to talk about an education policy issue. We go out to states to provide testimony or just connect with them on state relations visits, see what they're working on, see what they need help with. So we try to connect with states pretty frequently throughout the year in a lot of different ways, whether that's virtually or going out and meeting them in person.
All right. No, again, that's really interesting, because known and you and worked with some of you and not really had that complete picture of the work that you do. So again, I
Mm,
appreciate that. Um, I guess maybe digging a little bit into the how maybe of the work that you do. Or, the what, I guess maybe, in from the work that you're doing, what are some of the most important state and local context factors, that shape the work that you do with, state policymakers?
yeah, that's a good question. I'll talk quickly about some of the policy issues we're addressing. And again, we work on every issue under the sun, really.
Mm,
But recently, our steering committee came together and brainstormed a few policy priority areas that we'll be unveiling and working on more as the year goes on. But yeah, so we'll primarily focus on those areas and see where we can proactively help
mhm,
states. Beyond that, we're reacting to state needs, and like you said, the varying state contexts really impact how we're talking to any given state, right? We know that Wyoming maybe cares more about South Dakota or Montana than it does New York or California.
mm,
We just know that the different levels of funding, the different student populations, the different spread of schools across the state from urban to rural, we know that that all impacts what a state's looking for. And so while we won't advocate for any specific policy or tell states what to do, we'll connect them with other states that have the same populations, have the same type of funding challenges or opportunities, states that are working on the same issues, and we'll try to connect them so that they can work with like states to share the best information and share the approaches that they're all taking and learning from.
mhm. I mean, I think, sort of similarity in context makes a lot of sense,
Mhm.
particularly when trying to address issues of educational policy. Have you ever come across a situation where it would make sense to put Wyoming together with New Jersey and the learning situation?
Absolutely, yeah, yeah, and we certainly don't, when we compare them regionally, we also make sure that we're connecting them across all states.
Mm,
I mentioned earlier our 50 state comparisons that we pull together. Those are some of our most popular resources because states do want to see what's trending nationally, what states as a whole are doing, and then from there, kind of looking regionally to make some more specific connections for their context. But absolutely, yeah, we'll and oftentimes, too, when we do our thinkers meetings or communities of practice where we're bringing states together, we do want a mix of states with different contexts so that they can learn from each other and so that we can learn from them too to better support all states.
right. And I can imagine that conversation being really fascinating.
Yeah, they're
Um,
great.
But let's dig a little bit into one of your 50 state comparisons. I know you recently did work on supporting leadership preparation and development. So, that's our little sweet spot at UCEA. So, if you could tell us about, a little bit about how you did the work and then things that sort of surprised you from it.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll point to that resource, and then even more recently, a resource from my colleagues Tiffany McDowell and Lauren Pasach. They just put together a policy snapshot with trends over the last few years on state policies to advance school leadership. So I think between that and the 50 state comparison, we've tried to take a look at what challenges states are facing and what approaches they're taking. So yeah, I think in that, one thing that stood out very similarly to other professions in education, whether that's teaching, whether that's school nurses and school psychologists, I think we're seeing across states a need to, um, first of all, get more school leaders into schools and into districts, and then also making sure that they're qualified and prepared, and then making sure that they're staying in those schools. So I think the recruitment retention piece is something that we've seen bubble up, and the approaches to that have been pretty interesting across states.
Mhm. Anything strike you, particularly in recruitment or retention, that you'd like to share with us?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in the past few years, we've seen states consider apprenticeship pathways for school leaders. I think that's really unique as a way to help funnel um, qualified staff, existing teachers into those positions. You see apprenticeships for a lot of other education
Yeah.
issue areas or education roles. So, it would make sense that we're seeing that now for principals and school leaders. I think beyond that, yeah, I think we're seeing states looking at states tapping into different populations to fill those roles. So some states have passed legislation that would allow retired teachers or other retired school staff to come back and fill positions while removing some of the barriers to certification and licensure
Mm,
to make sure that they can get those positions filled more quickly.
mm. Yeah. And I've heard quite a bit about apprenticeships lately too. So it's interesting that you should bring that up as an emerging strategy to think about, not just filling the role of the principal, but then, sort of creating a different kind of learning opportunity and experiences before stepping into that role. In the comparison that you did, or even in this other report that you mentioned, are there challenges that are emerging or that you find consistent across states, regardless of context?
I think one challenge consistent across states is the lack of experience that we've seen in those leadership roles. So um, we've seen a study that shows that over 40% of principals working in their current schools have been there for 3 or fewer years.
Wow.
Right, and so I think these pipelines help get individuals into school leadership positions earlier so that they can stay there longer and build that experience. But I think another way that we've seen states approach that is providing a lot more professional development and supporting teachers regardless of experience or regardless of the type of school that we're in.
Mm,
And so I think we've seen that across a few different buckets. We've seen say, oh boy, tongue twister. We've seen states tackle that broadly.
uh-huh.
So, for instance, Alabama developed their principal leadership development system that
Mm,
provides professional development and other sport supports to principals in their systems. Just generally, we've
mhm,
also seen states look at a more targeted approach for schools and then a targeted approach for subjects. So, Virginia has legislation that would continue a PD program that helps increase the capacity and professional development for school leaders in underperforming schools specifically. And then in Wisconsin, we saw a bill that requires training on science based reading for school principals and other staff. So, again, just a broad spectrum of how states are providing support to school leaders.
I'm curious too, because you mentioned the school leadership development system. So I'm curious of whether you found more states sort of aligning the, preparation to induction to professional development and support in their thinking about leadership preparation and development.
Yeah, absolutely. I think states are starting to think of it more as a comprehensive experience.
Okay.
similar to how they would for supporting teachers. And so, like you said, all the way from induction throughout their careers, I think we've seen states provide more supports throughout.
Right. Now I mean, that's good to hear. I know that lots of districts and states have been working on doing that with their higher ed partners, so it's nice to see that it's sort of catching on. Um,
Absolutely.
I had a question about conversations that you may have had from something that you said about loosening licensure and certification requirements. Is that a trend that you're seeing happening across the country or just in areas with high turnover or high, or I guess low numbers of principals in schools?
Yeah, I think primarily in those areas, I think we've seen it as states. Um, we've seen it as an approach states take to look at kind of quick fix or um, quick response approaches to addressing, really high shortage levels, immediate needs. And so they're looking at getting as many people as they can quickly. But again, that's something we've seen in teaching too. And so we've seen that across states. Just as states are realizing that there are a lot of barriers to entry,
Right.
but still trying to find a balance of making sure that they're not loosening them too much so that and so that they can make sure that the experience is still there or that the qualifications are still there, right? Because at the end of the day, you do want qualified and effective principals in schools. You also want more of them. So
Right.
I think it's a fine line and certainly a balance that states have to play there.
Yeah. Yeah. And under, increasingly changing contexts, it's a hard thing to keep an eye on. Um,
Absolutely. Yeah.
I guess maybe changing just a bit, thinking about ways in which states are working together that might
Yeah.
not get a lot of attention, but that you think are actually having impact. If you could just give us a few examples of things that are working, which would be great.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's a little bit outside of the school leader space, but
Hmm.
just one that comes to mind for me. I've been doing some of our work on STEAM education and looking at arts integration into science, technology, engineering, and math.
Okay.
And so, with that, we have a cohort of states that we've been working with. We have 5 states: California, Iowa, Minnesota, Oregon, and Wisconsin. And I think it's representative of a lot of the work that we do at ECS. We've brought them together as a cohort earlier last year and then again in 2025. And they're all at different, trying to say they're in different spots in their approaches to STEAM education right now. So some might have a more fully developed definition. Some might still be defining STEAM in their state. Some might have specific roles within their state for STEM or STEAM education leaders,
Hmm.
and other ones are still at the front end of that work. So,
Hmm.
really, a wide variety of experiences and approaches across those states. But one thing that we've heard from them is that they just really valued the time being together
Hmm.
and having the opportunity to connect and learn from each other. And I think that's what we try to do at ECS is bring states together. Um, Again, regardless of contexts, but also providing them some contextual experiences and opportunities where it would be helpful, and just ensuring that they can grow together on any of these issues. So that was one where, some of the states that were on the earlier end of developing STEAM education definitions got to learn from other states and got to very directly implement some of the pieces of what they learned into their definitions, into their professional development, into how they're talking about it across the state with different role groups and state leaders. So I thought that was really interesting and invigorating to see.
Right, right, right. And sort of, how easy it is to find a place of common interest, right?
Yeah.
And also to address common concerns around STEM and around the arts and all of that and how to integrate the two. So I think, sometimes finding those smaller places of coherence or of similarity helps build into something bigger, right? That is impactful for both states or all states involved. I think that's both inspiring and hopeful, right? In terms of the difficulties and sometimes finding those points of common interest. um, I think, and here's a question that I'd love to hear your thoughts and experience on in terms of what are things that people who might be new to the policy realm, or who might be new to getting involved in advocating for something during the policy development process, and that, what would be some advice that you would give them in terms of learning the policy space? Because even in this brief conversation, it can be really complex. And then where best to sort of leverage their own knowledge and expertise as researchers, as faculty in higher ed.
I think that's a great question. I think that, you know, sometimes at ECS, we don't always get to see the implementation, right? I think we often see at that state level, that higher level of policy, things that are going into statute or regulations that are shaping, how districts and schools and individuals operate. And so sometimes we can lose that focus. So
Mhm.
I think one piece of advice would just be, I think at the end of the day, the state leaders that we work with are trying to make things better for students in their schools. And so I think just, yeah, having that frame of mind when folks are approaching it is helpful.
Mhm.
I think there are a lot of layers to policy, right? So I think, one example recently, our governor's State of the State addresses policy brief and policy tracking came out. And so we're looking at, what governors are prioritizing. And then from there throughout the year, we're following
Mhm.
how legislatures in those states are or aren't, implementing any of those recommendations or, and then from there we'll see district or other state level guidance. So, yeah, I think just, being able to follow a thread between from, what a state might be interested in prioritizing through implementation, but just focusing on the eventual outcomes, I think is one way that I would look at tackling it.
Yeah. Yeah, so what I hear you saying is that policy is a long game.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
which I think is, maybe sometimes where people get a little, I don't know what the word is, confused or something, or disheartened when things take longer than we can imagine. But as you said, it's like because there's so many layers, and because time is one of those layers, right? And so really, you can't really dip your water in. And know what's going on. You kind of have to wade in it for a while to really get a sense of who the actors are and what the implications are, and implementation challenges and things. So
Yeah.
I appreciate that, because it is often something that, again, for those of us who sort of are outside that space, can be a little like, what's going on here?
I think in addition to that too, I think one thing I would encourage folks who are new to the space to look at is there is a lot of good policy happening outside of the state level too, right? I think, you know, a governor's state of the state address or an executive order from a governor is just one way where we're seeing states take these approaches, right? And then the legislature is the next. But at the same time, um, oftentimes a bill might pass at the state level that leaves a lot of direction or decision up to the districts or the schools themselves. And again, ECS doesn't always get that deep into that, but sometimes, some of the most interesting or unique or innovative policies might happen either just in state guidance that's not in statute or legislation, or it might happen at the district level through guidance or other actions. So, yeah, I think, not only is it a long game, but there are a lot of ways to attack it other than just the big P policy legislation that's being introduced or enacted. So I think there are a lot of ways to for individuals to use their voice, for individuals to track what's most meaningful to them or where they can make a more local impact and following it through there.
Right. And I also think, like, from what you're saying too, it's we need people working at all those levels,
Absolutely.
but then to be some coherence also, right?
Yeah.
So that we're all not
Yeah.
pulling in different directions.
Yeah.
And I think ECS provides a lot of that really important foundational information, that people can, go to and read about as sort of a primer for the policies themselves, not necessarily the other stuff. But then knowing that is sort of step one. Final thought. We in season 2 of our podcast, one of our past presidents, Mary Arena Driscoll, talked about the importance of weaving, and the role, and she talked particularly about the role of higher ed as a weaver, in which you bring together disparate threads and you begin to work together to create something new and hopefully more sustainable. And so it sounds like some of the work that you do and the work that ECS does is sort of in this weaver role. Um, and so I just was curious as to how that metaphor strikes you. And does it describe your work well, do you think, or is there some other way you would think about describing your work?
Yeah, no, I think the metaphor hits the nail on the head for us at ECS. I think whether it's bringing folks together at our convenings or in small groups, another thing we do is respond to state information requests. So someone might reach out and we'll get them a response within 2 to 3 days or longer if they need more detailed information. Um, all that to say, it's interesting to see, you know, we'll get those individually, right? But it's interesting over the course of a year or over the course of multiple years, you'll see the same questions come in from different role groups, different states. And then we can take a step back and say, okay, governor in Idaho wanted this information, but then, the higher ed officer in California also wanted information about it. And, a legislator in Texas wanted information about it. What's going on here? How can we connect not only across states, but across role groups and get this information out there? And like you said, education's the long game. I remember at one point we were cleaning out the archives at the physical offices for ECS,
Mhm.
and we were looking at reports from the 80s, 70s, 60s, and it was interesting to see that a lot of the reports and titles of reports were about the same issues we're talking about today.
Wow. Right,
The
right, right.
approaches were very much the same. So everything's very um, uh, everything's very much a cycle,
Mhm.
and trends kind of come back. But I think one of the areas where we hope to weave states is, they're each working on these different issues and making progress in their own ways and innovating in their own ways, but finding the opportunity to help them find those best practices and work across states and continue to build towards solving these problems that have been on their plates for a short time or for decades, just
Mhm.
making sure that they can connect and grow and shape the best policy possible.
Right. Well, that's a perfect place to stop our conversation, Zeke. Again, thanks so much for taking time. I very much appreciate that. I very much appreciate the work that ECS has been doing, and the work that you continue to do to help us understand and shape educational policy moving forward. So, thank you so much again. And we'll have to meet up with some time, and you can quiz me on how well I'm doing.
Sounds great. Yeah, thanks so much for having me and letting me talk about Education Commission of the States. And yeah, hope to keep working with you too.
Great. Thanks, Zeke.
Yeah, thank you.
In the Lead is produced by University FM. We'd like to thank the UCEA community and you, our listeners, for your commitment to improving educational leadership and policy to create equitable, ethical, and socially just outcomes for each child.